Hi, I'm Jim Hightower, and I'm hoping that you will tune in to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour because it will turn you radioactive.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan. David is out today, but our co-host, Hannah Feldman, our producer, Hannah, is here. Hello, Hannah.
Hello, Steve.
And, of course, the man of the hour, Ralph. Hello, Ralph.
Hi, everybody.
On today's program, we welcome back Dr. Michael Osterholm, professor and director of the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy at the University of Minnesota. We've previously had him on the show to discuss the New York Times op-ed entitled, "We're Not Ready for a Flu Pandemic." That was back in 2018, nearly 2 years before the COVID-19 virus hit the shores of the United States. Dr. Osterholm has written a new book entitled The Big One, How We Must Prepare for Future Deadly Pandemics. The Big One is described as, quote, a gripping, comprehensive, and urgent wake-up call because COVID-19 was just a taste of what's to come, unquote. We'll speak to Dr. Osterholm about his new book, and hopefully this time, our leaders will listen. Then Ralph is going to give us a number of quick takes on the state of the Democratic Party, Trump's ballroom, the private funding of the military, and the Gaza ceasefire. As always, somewhere in the middle, we'll check in with our indomitable corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, after all that has happened in the past 5 years, are we still not ready for the next pandemic? Hannah?
Dr. Michael Osterholm is a professor and director of the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy at the University of Minnesota. In November 2020, Dr. Osterholm was appointed to President-elect Joe Biden's 13-member transition COVID-19 advisory board. He is the author of Deadliest Enemy, Our War Against Killer Germs, and he hosts a weekly podcast called the Osterholm Update, which offers discussion and analysis on the latest infectious disease development. His latest book, co-authored with Mark Olshaker, is The Big One, How We Must Prepare for Future Deadly Pandemics. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Dr. Michael Osterholm.
Thank you very much. It's a real honor to be with you again.
Welcome back, Mike. We've known each other for many, many years, and I've watched your career, which is really one of forthright candor, precision. You know the bad side of science, you know the great side of science, and you tell the truth, which is why we want you on this program. Now, just to start on a successful note, there was this spread of the deadly Ebola virus, and that has a huge proportion of people who are infected who then die, as well as the MERS, MERS epidemic, which I think was started in Saudi Arabia. And they were contained from spreading around the world. So tell us, Mike, how were they contained?
How a virus is transmitted has a lot to say about what risk it is to the community. Is it going to spread quickly, or is it one that's very hard to spread? And the worst kind of transmission we can have is that of respiratory transmission. We're just breathing the air, that invisible thing you take in and out every minute. And if the virus is in that, can you in fact get infected? Ebola, for decades, was always thought to be what we call basically a body fluid contact transmission, meaning you had to have contact with blood or some other body fluid of an infected individual. However, there has always been this concern among some of us that it could become an airborne transmitted disease where just breathing would do that. And don't forget, remember, for some of us that are old enough, one of the most famous books of the 1990s was The Hot Zone by Richard Preston, which was all about a large outbreak of Ebola that occurred among primates, monkeys, in a large monkey holding facility near Washington, D.C., and which there was classic airborne transmission there that transmitted the virus throughout. It was the very thesis of the book. In addition, we've had several other reports of outbreaks in laboratories around the country among primates, monkeys, where they were nowhere near the infected monkey that was at another side of the room, and then they got infected. And so we raised the point to say that right now, clearly Ebola is primarily transmitted via body fluid contact, but be prepared. What would happen if one day we saw it transmitted via the airborne route? And remember, up until just the COVID pandemic, we never thought that coronaviruses could cause a pandemic. And you mentioned the one coronavirus, MERS, and there's another coronavirus, SARS. Now, those are two that I did work on. And the SARS outbreak, which occurred in 2003, was a coronavirus infection that occurred in China, spread to other parts of the world. And at that time, I was still splitting my time between the University of Minnesota and the Department of Health and Human Services, and I was involved with the SARS investigation and follow-up. Then along comes MERS in 2012, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, which was again another coronavirus. And that one originated in camels and transmitted to humans. And actually, I had been serving as an advisor of the royal family of the United Arab Emirates. And so I was actually on the Arabian Peninsula working on MERS at the time when this all happened. And then a large outbreak occurred in Seoul, Korea in 2015 when an individual had traveled to the Arabian Peninsula, had come back to Seoul, was infected. No one recognized that he actually had MERS and transmitted in several hospitals to a number of people who died. And again, I was in Seoul working on that outbreak at Samsung Medical Center. And so, I've had that firsthand experience. How do we control them? Well, we were fortunate that with both SARS and MERS, they were not that infectious except for a very few people who we call super spreaders. Basically, the vast majority of people, even if you were around them, never transmitted the virus. And by identifying those people who were likely to transmit more and isolating them, we were able to bring it under control and basically eliminate it. Now, the key message, though, that came out of those two outbreaks, both SARS and MERS, is the fact that they killed between 15% of the people, as for SARS, up to 35% of the people for MERS. Imagine if we had a coronavirus pandemic that was caused by one of those viruses that actually also had the capacity to be transmitted, like SARS-CoV-2 or COVID. It would be a whole different ballgame, as opposed to about a 1% of the population who got infected dying. We're talking about 15, 20, or 30%. You can see how quickly this would basically become a nightmare scenario. So that's what we're up against today, and we need to be prepared for this. We now have identified viruses in the wild that actually are, in fact, capable of being transmitted likely at the same high level as SARS-CoV-2 or COVID, but also kill at the same level as MERS and SARS did. So these Ebola viruses are still something we have to keep mindful of. That could happen someday. I still believe that. And we surely have to worry about MERS and SARS-like viruses that become highly infectious.
Before we go into the categories of unpreparedness, we've got something in this country already that's very worrisome. The avian flu that started with poultry and has moved into other mammals like pigs. Describe the fear here and how many of the scientists who are tracking it have been laid off or fired by the Trump regime.
Well, first of all, I think just to confirm the very point you're making is the fact that pandemics happen, and specifically influenza pandemics. Really, the worst pandemic in the last 130 years was the 1918 influenza pandemic, H1N1, the swine flu pandemic. And pandemics occur when you have a respiratory transmitted virus, one that's easily transmitted to someone else by just being in their general vicinity. And the fact that it's a new virus, meaning that you don't have any previous immunity to it. And so this was a situation in 1918 where suddenly this virus emerged. We now have reconstructed it based on genetic studies we did on autopsy specimens and so forth. We could recapture that old dead virus and now show what it was like back then. And in that case, it's a situation where once that virus changed, it rapidly transmitted between humans, and it was only the humans that were really transmitted to each other. What we're concerned about now is we're primed for an influenza pandemic someday, where a new influenza virus will emerge, and when it takes off, it'll rapidly spread through the people, and wherever it came from, whether it was a bird species or another animal, will not be that important because now it's transmitting among humans. The natural reservoir, or the place where these influenza viruses reside, is largely aquatic birds, migratory birds. And they actually can get infected and not die from the virus. They can continue to transmit the virus amongst each other. And what we've seen with H5N1 since 1997, when it first showed up in Hong Kong, was the fact that it can also now infect other birds besides aquatic birds, including poultry, which it can be lethal to, as well as more recently showing other mammal species could get infected with it. The trillion-dollar question is, Will it ever change enough to transmit to people so that they then transmit to others? There have been roughly about 1,500 deaths due to H5N1 dating back to its original location in Hong Kong in 1997. But it's never been able to demonstrate ongoing transmission. And I think at this point, I have to say I probably know less about H5N1 now than I did 10 years ago. And I've been investigating this. I was actually in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, working on H5N1 in the early days. I was here as part of the National Science Advisory Board on Biosecurity, a new group that had been put together by the federal government to oversee the safety of research conducted by the federal government. And I can tell you that in 2012, I was in a room at NIH with a number of other members of this board, listening to two very senior influenza researchers say we're one mutation away from H5N1 causing a horrible pandemic. Never happened. 2015 comes along, and we see a big outbreak in the Nile River Valley among duck farmers because the ducks had gotten infected. Aha, here it is. It's going to happen now. Never happened. Then cases dropped off until we get to the time period of 2023, and we're still seeing migratory birds moving the virus into the poultry operations, but not really a human issue. And then in 2023, we first saw it pick up in cattle, in the dairy cattle. And again, everybody said, this is it, it's going to happen. Well, it's now been almost 15 months since we first saw it show up in dairy cattle. We've just not had evidence of people getting seriously ill with that virus who are in contact with it and then basically needing to be hospitalized. It just hasn't happened. So I don't know what H5N1 will do, but I want to be really clear about one thing. There will be an influenza virus that will cause a pandemic in the future. And the pandemic clock is ticking. We just don't know what time it is. It could be tomorrow that this happens. And so we have to be much better prepared for it. And just know that whether it's H5N1 or some other influenza virus, we're still in the period of really lack of preparedness, high risk combination.
Well, as you said once, quote, humanity has become an extraordinarily efficient biological mixing bowl as well as a highly productive viral mutation factory, end quote. Let's start with the first area of unpreparedness, international unpreparedness, which has been worsened by the Trump regime's isolationism on this issue. Since a lot of these viruses come from other countries, it makes sense to have foreign treaties that provide budgets, monitors, exchanges, early alerts, and focus on where the heart of the epidemic or pandemic is in some country around the world. How badly unprepared are we for that?
Well, Ralph, let me say that this is not a point in time because I think it's fair to say that we continue to be more unprepared every day. It's actually building. It all started when the administration first announced within a day of taking office that we would withdraw from the World Health Organization. We were a very prime member of that organization. We provided valuable support. We had more than 50 U.S. public health scientists who worked at CDC and elsewhere who were stationed in Geneva, helping to support WHO activities. And when we were cut off from that, it was not only that we didn't support them, but we no longer had the ability to communicate with them. That was made very clear by the administration. So we lost a very valuable asset there in terms of this kind of communication you're talking about. And that is best demonstrated by the fact that we have been a primary player with WHO in selecting the new flu strains every year for seasonal vaccines around the world. So about 8 to 9 months before the flu season starts in the southern hemisphere or the northern hemisphere, we start looking at what vaccines should we get ready for that next winter. And we need those data so that we can actually then make sure we have the best match. We don't have access to that anymore other than third hand. We don't have access right now to a lot of the work that WHO is doing in terms of responding to outbreaks. We just have seen an outbreak of Ebola in the Democratic Republic of Congo that is now under control, but that basically, again, we were getting information basically third hand in that area there. More importantly, for even flu preparedness, we have been a place where many of the flu viruses of the world were sent to CDC for further evaluation and sequencing to know what these viruses look like, what changes were occurring that were important for vaccine development. We have seen a huge drop in the number of virus isolations sent to us in this country. And finally, I just have to say that this is a heartbreaking moment for all of us in public health, is the fact that PEPFAR, basically the president's program to address HIV, started by George Bush, has been nothing short of a modern public health and medical miracle, where we have provided drugs to persons who are HIV infected in 31 different countries, low-income countries. We have literally stopped the primary transmission in many countries of infection from an infected mom delivering their child, where the child actually gets exposed at time of delivery. And then they become infected, and we just continue this generational issue. Well, by providing drugs to the mom, you could actually keep the child from becoming infected. By providing drugs to those who are infected, we could actually see people live healthy, otherwise normal lives. There was an amazing, amazing response of what I call soft diplomacy around the world that literally prevented upwards of 30 million people from dying from HIV/AIDS in the last 2 decades. And today, we ended all those programs. And many of these programs, we're talking about cents on the dollar for a drug treatment every day. We saw incredible compliance where we had organizations set up with women on their motorcycles every day delivering drugs in villages around these countries and making certain that people got vaccinated. We not only won the goodwill of so many countries out there because of what we did, but we had incredible access to the kind of information you just talked about, Ralph, this surveillance information. You know, they willingly gave us this information because of what we were doing for them. We helped set up schools. We helped get malaria prevention nets, nets that were basically exposed to these chemicals that would keep the mosquitoes out. And we've done in all of that. That's not being done. So we're really at a point in my 50-year career in public health where we've never been further from doing good nationwide, worldwide public health than we are right now.
But just put it in context, listeners. This is the result of Donald Trump and Elon Musk shutting down the Agency for International Development, which was a delivery system. They literally, physically shut it down. They boarded up the headquarters and laid off most of the workers. And is it fair to say, Michael, that now millions will start dying from HIV? Or is anybody taking up the slack here? Some major foundations like the Gates Foundation, which has the money to replace the modest sums that led to such huge life-saving results?
You know, unfortunately, Ralph, we've only seen very limited support that way. Every country seems to have their financial crisis right now. A good example is Europe, which in the past has been generous in helping to support public health activities. They've also surely provided money for research in the vaccine area. But what we've seen is with the events of Ukraine, the European countries going from 2 to 3% GDP for defense to 7 or 8, 9% GDP. And in that process, one of the places they pulled money from was this very area. So it's not only the United States doing what it did, but countries like Europe also basically have pulled back. And so unfortunately for much of the world right now, there is very limited kind of support for what once was being done. And I might just add one last piece. If you want to look at from an economic standpoint, having a country of healthy people who are functioning every day, supporting the economy of that country is everything that's about positive about the United States' financial investment, because we end up selling goods into those countries. We end up basically not having to fight a war or to end up having a crisis on our hands because of that. And that's all changed now. So now we even have any financial benefits from what we once did, where the payback on those efforts were remarkable. To answer your question about the deaths, I fear this immensely. You know, I still have, almost like so many of my colleagues, post-traumatic stress, remembering the early days of HIV/AIDS. And there were times in the late 1980s, early 1990s, where I would go to up to 5 funerals a week in this city. And that was the norm. And then retroviral drugs came along and revolutionized everything. Well, I'm telling you, what's going to happen in Africa in particular, over the course of the next 3 to 5 years, is going to make what I went through and others like that minor compared to what they're going to see in terms of the number of deaths and challenges in these countries.
What's surprising is it's so cheap to provide these HIV medicines. It comes down to about 12 cents a day while they're being administered. Why isn't a country like China or major foundations like the Gates Foundation moving into this huge life-saving vacuum that is so inexpensive comparatively?
Well, China is moving into some degree, and this is their soft diplomacy starting to unfold. You know, we never had to compete with China in many of these countries for the hearts and minds of the citizens of that country because of what we did with our soft diplomacy, where we helped out like that. That's all changing. And so China is picking up some of it. But let me say that it's one thing to buy the drug, it's another thing to have the delivery system to get it there, and particularly in many areas of the world that basically, because of the crowded, large metropolitan areas or the rural areas with very poor roads and so forth, you have to have really a comprehensive system set up for delivery. How do you keep track of the millions and millions of people that need drug every day? That too was destroyed when USAID went down. Those records were no longer available. And so a foundation, any one country beyond the likes of the United States, would find it very difficult to come in and set that all up. It's not just about having the drug, but how you deliver it. So imagine today if we didn't have a single internet cable strung throughout the United States and we had to start internet today. It would take us years to build that up, to have that kind of infrastructure in place. And so that's part of the challenge we have today is that it wasn't just taking the drugs away, it was the intentional effort to destroy the systems that actually made it possible to deliver those drugs. That's what I find so difficult.
Well, it's intentional right across the board. Let's talk about the Trump regime since January 20th, cutting budgets and laying off workers, disrupting the work of Centers for Disease Control and National Institutes of Health, even the Food and Drug Administration. And that affects state public health departments as well, their budgets and their support structure from the federal government. Could you give us a quantitative and qualitative description, Mike, of what's going on right now? Instead of building from a base of modest preparedness from the prior administration, and I emphasize modest, they're going backwards. Also, with quackery positions on a whole variety of issues, that is dividing the population, feeding the misinformation on the internet, and general chaos of information transmission. Give us a scene here. And what is the budget right now for pandemics, if there is one?
Well, let me just say, Ralph, that for all the listeners here, let me just add some context to my comments. You know, I've had the good fortune to serve in every presidential administration since Ronald Reagan and HIV/AIDS in the 1980s with the HIV/AIDS Commission. And you know, I have served in the first Trump administration as a science envoy for the State Department, trying to help the rest of the world get ready for a pandemic, which then came a year and a half later. During my time in public health, the 50 years, I've also was 25 of those years, both at the University of Minnesota and the State Health Department in Minnesota. And while I was at the Minnesota Department of Health, I served 2 Republican governors, 2 Democratic governors, as we affectionately say in Minnesota, for those who are old enough to remember, 1 independent wrestler, Jesse Ventura. And I can say without any question, my entire job was about doing my job. It was not partisan. It was the issue of call balls and strikes. I'm just a party to the public health army that my job is to help whoever's there. So today, my comments, please take them in that same vein. I'm still very much a nonpartisan individual. I'm about getting public health carried out, and hopefully that comes across here. But having said that, let me just say that what we've seen happen has been an absolute destruction of much of the public health capacity we have in this country at the federal level. CDC, with the rifts that have occurred, the overall issues of leadership there, which is really in the hands now of political appointed individuals who have no public health experience or background. We've seen the major cuts that have occurred at NIH with disruption of funding there, and of course at the FDA. It's going to take us years to recover from the kind of what I guess I would call and organizational destruction that's occurred. And right now, if we had a major hit in this country, for example, with a bioterrorism weapon, there is no one today in the White House or the National Security Council with any expertise in biopreparedness. No one. That's never happened in my lifetime as such, to see something like that. If you were to have to call on the CDC and the only people you had at the upper echelon level were people with no expertise in any kind of area of biologic activity, what would you do? How would you do it? So I think this is the challenge. In addition, there have been some other choices made that really play, Ralph, to the question you're asking earlier about the pandemics. Today, our capacity globally to make influenza vaccines is limited because we still use embryo chicken eggs for growing the virus. It's a 1950s technology. Well, if we had a pandemic today caused by influenza, in the first year, we could possibly make, and that's if everything goes right, about enough vaccine to vaccinate a quarter of the world. That's it. That's it. If we had a new mRNA technology vaccine for influenza, which could very well easily be as effective, if not more effective than our current vaccines, because of the way in which we could make it, we could have enough vaccine for the world likely in the first year. You know, the difference between those two scenarios is millions and millions and millions of lives. Now, what happened? Well, the previous administration identified $500 million through the agencies at Health and Human Services to actually intensify, prioritize, and actually define what we could do with mRNA vaccines for influenza. And I'm certain we could have a much more effective vaccine than we have now, and that could be done at a much, much faster speed. That $500 million was just unilaterally cut because they didn't want investment in mRNA technology, and instead it was then handed over to a career NIH investigator without any real review to look at another flu virus vaccine, one that the technology had already been disproved 30 years ago. And that made no sense whatsoever. So if we in fact do confront an influenza pandemic anytime soon, know that we're going to have a major vaccine shortage. It won't be available initially. And, you know, we're going to be asking the rest of the world to help us out. And they're going to say to us, no, not really. You get in the end of the line. You already made your choices. And so this is a huge point. If you look at across the board right now for disease surveillance, you know, I realize that the government shutdown has added to the confusion right now of what's happening. But Ralph, I couldn't tell you right now for certain what's happening in many of the infectious diseases in this country. It'd be like having smoke alarms that had no batteries. And that's the challenge we're up against right now. So, you know, I will just make one prediction here today. There is going to be a large, huge, overwhelming crisis that is going to occur eventually around an infectious disease issue in this country. And it's going to happen because Mother Nature herself does that to us. Just like hurricanes are not optional, these large outbreaks are not optional. What's optional is how well we respond to them and limit their impact. And we are at a point right now where we have very, very limited impact on these things. So I think the public needs to be aware we're in a very different setting today for public health response to a crisis than we've ever been in my 50 years in the business.
Well, you know, judging by the comments of Donald Trump and RFK Jr., they don't seem to be worried at all about these kinds of epidemics, whether it's influenza or whether it's a new mutation out of the COVID pandemic, which leads to my next question. There's got to be an adequate budget here, and the budgets are very inadequate, and they've been cut even further since the July legislation in this area, as well as jeopardizing people's Medicaid health insurance, which of course is a major step in getting diagnosis and treatment. And if you don't have health insurance, you're not likely to go into that diagnosis and treatment mode. On the other hand, Trump's added $150 billion more dollars to the Defense Department, and more than the generals have asked for, and $45 billion to the ICE operation on immigrant apprehension and deportation. So what about defining pandemic preparedness as a core national security issue and have it funded under the wing of the Defense Department, whose budget is immune from diminution in Congress? Now, there was a time when public health specialists wanted more research on prostate cancer. and they got more funds because it was incorporated under part of the Pentagon budget. What about dealing with the budgetary problem by putting it under national defense? Obviously, the soldiers are very much exposed, and nobody is immune from this kind of pandemic contagion. What about that as a first step?
Well, let me just start out by affirming something you just said, and that is the fact that we're all vulnerable to this, including, of course, the military. And I find it very concerning right now that in all the years I've been involved with bioterrorism related events, and as you know, that this is something I've spent a lot of time on, I've never seen us more vulnerable. Any country out there today, or any group that wants to take on the United States with a bioterrorism attack, understands that we're weaker than we've ever been. We have little capacity to detect an outbreak until it has really done major damage, that we don't have a plan for how to respond to it. We don't have the personnel to respond to it. And so it boggles my mind to think that we would let ourselves become that vulnerable. We might as well be telling the world that we're shutting down all of our ballistic missile capacity for cost savings reasons for the next 6 years. I mean, what's that all about? So I think that we have to understand that this is a vulnerability to the security of our country, and it's not being addressed. But the second piece, you're asking about the public health funding. One of the challenges we've had with public health funding over the years has been that basically, you get your annual appropriations or every other year appropriations, but there's not a real continuity to what happens. And unlike in the Defense Department, if I'm going to procure a new aircraft carrier, I know for the next 14 years, it's going to take that amount of money or more, we usually cost overruns, to build that aircraft carrier. We don't go in and fund it for the first year or 2 years and then decide after the third year, we're going to fund it again or not. We need in a public health system to be able to have a way of assuring that when we set up the kind of surveillance activities we're doing, how we do public health, that we're not up for reconsideration that calls into question whether we should exist or not every 1 to 2 years. And we need to fund this much more like we do the Defense Department funding. Now, whether protecting it in the Defense Department or not is a good idea, you're much more expert than that than I am. All I can say is that we have a very poor way of funding things now. And then on top of that, again, if we look at public health funding, the question becomes, okay, what is the benefit and return on that? And one of the problems we have is that when you do your job and you do it really well, nothing happens. And when nothing happens, people say, well, why are we paying for this? A good example are vaccines. You know what? When you don't have measles cases and you don't have polio cases, people will say, well, this is not a big deal. Why do we need to support this? Why should we make people get these vaccines? Only do you realize how important that is when you stop making them available, you stop funding that kind of work, and then suddenly you have all these outbreaks. You know, Ralph, the year I was born in this country, there were over 55,000 cases of polio, of which 21,000 were paralytic polio cases. That's in my lifetime, okay? I mean, I could go through the laundry list of all the outbreaks and all the routine vaccine familial disease problems we've had. And so now people are going to say, well, we don't need to fund these things, so they're not a problem. That's when they come back. And so your point's a really good one. We need to do a whole new evaluation of what's the risk benefit. What do we get out of funding public health? And in some cases, we're going to show what we got was nothing happened. And you know what? That came at a cost. That's what's really, I think, such an important point.
Well, just if there are any vaccine skeptics out there, it's important to note that vaccine research should rely on adequate clinical trials, should be open, it should be peer reviewed. There shouldn't be any corporate commercial cover-ups or distortions. It needs to be said. But just very briefly, how many lives do you think have been saved by the smallpox vaccine and the diphtheria vaccine?
Millions and millions and millions. Just to give you an idea, in the 20th century, 1900 through 1978, even though over half the world was vaccinated in the first part of the 20th century, smallpox still killed 300 million people in the 20th century before we finally eradicated it totally in 1978. Think of that, 300 million
Say that
people.
number again.
300 million people died from smallpox. and that was in the 20th century. I'm not talking about the Middle Ages. I'm not talking about, before modern medical care. We basically have fundamentally rewritten the history of our world based on eradication of smallpox. A vaccine did that, a vaccine. I can tell you, Ralph, early in my career, I worked on a disease called Haemophilus influenzae type B. It's a bacteria infection that causes young children to get meningitis and subsequently die, hearing loss, etc. We would have over 10,000 cases of that disease every year in this country, with a number of those children dying or having serious lifelong impacts, such as deafness as a result of the infection. And we introduced a vaccine in the late 1980s. And you know what, Ralph? If we have 5 to 10 cases a year today, that's a lot. And that's going to start changing as more and more people shy away from getting that vaccine.
Give us a history of diphtheria and measles here.
Well, the same thing. Measles, I look back on that. We had the same issues of the kinds of thousands of cases of measles that occurred, much as I just gave you with polio. Same thing is true with diphtheria. Pertussis, before the first pertussis vaccines became available in the 1940s, we had over 40,000 deaths that occurred from pertussis. Think of that.
That's whooping cough.
That's whooping cough. And so all of these diseases had major, major impact, and we don't think about them anymore because they're gone. Now, I have to say, if you're in many parts of the world, in low-income countries, they still are seeing sizable numbers of cases, but even there, they've been greatly reduced because of vaccines. And what I worry about is programs like Gavi, which is a program that allows us to purchase vaccines to give to the low-income countries. We pulled all of our support out for that. I mean, it makes no sense what we're doing here in terms of improving world health. It just makes no sense.
We're talking with Professor Michael Osterholm, University of Minnesota, co-author with Mark Olshaker of the new book called The Big One, How We Must Prepare for Future Deadly Pandemics. Well, let me make my 2 cents worth here, and you can comment on each one. One way, when a pandemic is on its way, or even before, we have a program that focuses on the one person that most people trust in this country when it comes to healthcare, and that's their personal physician. In the COVID epidemic, I was disappointed that there wasn't more attention for all the million personal physicians in this country to inform their patients about proper mask wearing, etc. That's one that ought to be done. The second is we should have what are called informal congressional hearings by the Democrats, who can take a committee room, have prominent witnesses, have prominent victims, have the press there, and go through the whole sequence of how we can become prepared from A to Z through congressional initiatives. The third recommendation is for a delegation of scientists to request a meeting with President Trump. He came down with COVID, almost miraculously recovered from it, treatment at Walter Reed Military Hospital. But the one thing about pandemics, Michael, is even if you are ideologically rigid and masochistic about what needs to be done, you know that you're as vulnerable as the next person, whether you're Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal, red state, blue state. So I would urge a personal meeting from a delegation of scientists with Donald Trump, who does react to personal meetings. And he, of course, is cognizant of his role, plus and minus, during the coronavirus pandemic that started in 2020 when it came in from China. The other recommendation I would make is an international convention of scientists and international lawyers to draft effective foreign treaties here that are not only well funded, but also enforced. Because people may say, oh, who cares what goes on in the Congo? Really? Well, the people in the Congo can get on a plane and come to New York City and, it's off to the deadly races here. So this xenophobia doesn't work when it comes to pandemics. What do you think of all those?
Well, I think these are the kinds of things we need to be thinking about. And I just want to emphasize a point you just made. Infectious diseases know no global boundaries. International boundaries mean nothing to infectious diseases. I even think about when the COVID really unfolded in China back in early 2020, and we all were so concerned about that entering our country. So we fortified the Western ports in terms of both airplanes and ships, and thought we'd keep it out. Well, lo and behold, it went from China to Italy and caused an outbreak there, and it came from Italy to the East Coast, New York City particularly. So meanwhile, while we were fortifying the West Coast, the East Coast totally open, and it entered our country quite easily. And so I think that it just raises the point that you made, is we have to have international preparedness because it's all going to be about international issues. And we need to find the kind of ways that can be consequential in terms of our policy and decision makers. I'd be happy right now to have neutral decisions, but what I worry about is we continue to see day after day negative decisions that are being made about preparedness. At this point, Secretary Kennedy has made it very clear that his intent is to, in a sense, limit vaccine access to the public based on his statements about vaccines and what they mean. That is dangerous, dangerous language in terms of the public's understanding of why vaccines are so important and what they can do to improve our health. So, Ralph, as always, you are the one that thinks about these issues and ways to have a consequential difference, and I thank you very much for that.
Let's get an estimate from you. What would be an adequate federal budget helping state and local institutions as well to begin the preparedness of our country against these pandemics?
Yeah. I can't give you an exact number right now, in part because it's a moving target given how much we're taking away from already existing capacity that we have to make up before we even start to make ground again. But, we're talking about a very, very small amount. When you think about the fact that microbes have killed many, many, many more Americans than any bullets or bombs have done. And yet look how much we invest in our Defense Department. And I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't. I don't know enough to know about what's the right amount to invest in defense. But I can tell you, if your number one killer are microbes, not somebody's enemies, bullets, etc., why wouldn't you invest in trying to stop that type of situation from happening? And if that were the case, we're talking about a minuscule rounding error of what the defense budget is.
Let's talk about how mobilized people have to be at the neighborhood level, regardless of other issues we've discussed. Let's start with the mask. Could you explain the CDC early announcement telling people not to buy masks on TV, which started the doubt and the internet skepticism on masks, which you, in your book, highlight the very great importance of the right mask and the right fit, the N95 mask and the right fit.
Yeah, exactly. One of the ways in which you surely can protect yourself against airborne diseases, and if you want to understand what an airborne disease is about, think of yourself walking down the street today and suddenly you smell the cigarette smoke and you look up the sidewalk upwind 30, 40 feet and there's somebody smoking. That's an aerosol. Smoke is an aerosol like that. Very fine particles that float. And one of the problems is, we talk about safety of our water supplies, our food supply, anything we put in our mouth like that. We don't think at all about the safety of the air that we're breathing every day, every hour, every minute. So when you have a situation where you might be exposed to an infectious agent in the air, using this N95 respirator, which is a tight face-fitting material that then actually has the part of the material that you breathe through, is actually what we call melt blown, meaning that it is a type of electrically charged material that is open to space enough to let air move in and out readily, but it has an electrostatic charge that traps the virus, so the virus can't get in and out. These are commonly available at the Home Depots, that you name it, okay? In fact, the vast majority of N95 use during the regular lives is for industrial purposes, working in the workplace. And so if you were to use those, you can greatly reduce your risk of inhaling an infectious agent. So again, urge you to use an N95 respirator. I'm hopeful that the next time around we have a pandemic, we won't be seeing nearly as many mixed messages, or hopefully none, about should you be using a respirator, when and how. And I think that's really an important point.
Well, most of the people who I see wearing masks are wearing either surgical type masks or others that really are almost worthless in terms of protection.
They are worthless, and that's unfortunate because people think they're protecting themselves and they're not.
The other area of mobilization, you mentioned in your book that anywhere from a third to a half of transmissions occur inside households, inside apartments, inside homes, with 2-3 generations of relatives, for example, and the elderly being particularly vulnerable. Could you talk about the precautions that have to be taken there?
Yeah, it's surely a situation where there's no ideal answer for this one, because if you're living 3 generations to a 2-bedroom apartment, you can't isolate. You can't find a way to put the person who's infected in a place where you are not going to be breathing their air. This is a real challenge. It's why we need to, in fact, do much more research on air quality in general and how do we improve it. For example, there's certain kind of filters that you can put into your room that can hopefully, depending on the size of the room, take much of the virus out of the room and actually contain it from you then breathing it. But I think this is another area that we have a lot of research that we need to do to better understand how can we make sure that under whatever condition you're living in, the air that you're breathing is not contaminated with the virus.
So let me ask some quick practical questions.
Okay.
With the schools, it's going to raise the question of mandatory vaccine and closing or opening schools. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, first of all, I have never been a supporter of mandatory vaccines for COVID. And the reason for that is not because I don't think they're important or good, and I surely recommend people get them, but they don't necessarily stop transmission or someone from becoming infected. And so in that sense, unlike mumps, measles, and rubella, where in fact those vaccines actually stop you from getting infected and transmitting in the community. So getting vaccinated is for a community good. For this one, it's really more a matter of it's going to help you have a much greater likelihood of a very mild illness and not a serious life-threatening illness. So I think this is where public health has to rethink, when are vaccines mandated, when are they not? I'm a big supporter of mandated vaccines for the routine childhood vaccines. I think we need to be much more thoughtful about these other ones. In terms of schools, I would say at this point, what I had proposed all along was we don't do lockdowns. They won't work. Lockdowns have to then be in place for the duration of 3 years. That's never going to happen. But what I had proposed was snow days. One of the things that we learned early in the pandemic is if you want to save lives, you got to have adequate medical care. You can't have a hospital that's at 140% capacity, people in beds in hallways and parking garages and so forth. And the way you hopefully keep that down is have the public know, what is the bed capacity today in my hospital in my town? Is it at 90%, 100%? And if it gets to a certain level, you say to people, please, now is the time for the next 7 to 10 days, pull back on your activities. Now is the time to temporarily close schools, like a snow day. Now is the time, if you can avoid being in public places, do that. Get that number back down in terms of the number of beds that are occupied, and you're going to have a much better chance of, in fact, saving people's lives by having adequate medical care if you do that.
Recommendations for this season's flu virus and COVID vaccine, what are they?
Currently, both are recommended as they would normally be. Everyone is eligible for a COVID or a flu shot. Again, I am one of those ones that say if I would get mine, particularly for those who are at greater risk, for example, either influenza or COVID and having serious illness. But let me just remind people, 285 kids died this past year from influenza. Half of them had no identified risk factor for any kind of serious illness. So as a parent, would I want my kid vaccinated? You bet I would. As a son or a daughter, would I want my grandparents vaccinated? You bet I would. And so I think I still encourage these vaccines very, very much. And they have clearly proven that they can reduce serious illness, hospitalizations, and deaths.
Well, we're out of time. Unfortunately, we've been speaking with Dr. Michael Osterholm, author with Mark Olshaker of the brand new book called The Big One, How We Must Prepare for Future Deadly Pandemics. They use hypotheticals to get it very specific and not just rely on statistics. And one commentator said it reads like a thriller, but it also reads like a very pragmatic tutorial. Thank you.
Thanks, Ralph.
We've been speaking with Dr. Michael Osterholm. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Up next, some quick takes on current events from Ralph. But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, October 31, 2025. I'm Russell Mokhiber. Cancer rates among young adults in the Corn Belt, a patchwork of golden fields and straight-line highways stretching across the heart of the Midwest, are rising more rapidly than in the country as a whole. That's according to a report in the Washington Post. The 6 leading states for corn production, Iowa, Nebraska, Illinois, Minnesota, Indiana, and Kansas, had the same cancer frequency as the rest of the nation for young adults and the overall population when state-level tracking began in 1999. In the 2000s, they began to diverge, and since 2015, the states have had a significantly higher cancer rate among those ages 15 to 49. In the latest data from 2022, those states have a rate 5% higher for young adults and 5% higher for the overall population. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with Hannah and Ralph. So, Ralph, you have some choice words for the state of the Democratic Party and how they're reacting to the Trump administration. What are your thoughts there?
Well, focusing on the Democratic Party leadership and exempting some really good progressive candidates trying to replace some of these entrenched corporate Democrats in 2026 elections, I can say that the Democratic Party leadership has its own AI business, arrogant ignorance, which it contracts out to corporate conflicted consultants who run their campaigns, from raising money, strategies, tactics, scheduling, what the candidate can say or should not say. And they've got clients in the corporate world defining conflict of interest. So they have their own AI called arrogant ignorance. And they better take a look at themselves in the mirror and start listening to some of the more progressive Democrats knocking on the doors of these cloistered Democratic Party apparatchiks.
Ralph, do you think someone like Zoran Mamdani should be the future of the Democratic Party?
Well, certainly. And, the Democrats have a way of taking a small victory and exaggerating it. He's going to be in a tight corporate-controlled city, the bastion of Wall Street. The real estate interests are going to come down hard on him. Wall Street brokers are going to come down hard on him because he wants to increase taxes on the wealthy. And, of course, the genocidal domestic Israeli lobby can't stand him. So he's going to require a lot of civic mobilization because he has the votes to win, but that doesn't mean he has the civic power mobilized to govern in the way he wants to govern. But certainly it's a very bright window opening up for the Democratic Party, albeit in a heavily Democratic city. This is not happening in Dallas, Texas, or Miami, Florida.
Ralph, a lot of news about Trump's ballroom, which when I look at scale models of it, looks like will be actually bigger than the White House itself. What's your take on Trump's ballroom?
Well, it's patently illegal and unconstitutional, and I've talked to a dozen reporters and editors, and they just don't get it yet. You cannot have private donations, corporate or otherwise, to fund a federal construction project. And it's clear why. It violates the Anti-Deficiency Act and the Constitution, which gives Congress the exclusive spending power, the exclusive appropriations power. Only Congress can fund this. So Trump is getting away day after day by distracting people of how enormous this ballroom is and all the architectural reviews that they are exempted from. But it's not true. The White House is exempted from reviews by these historical architectural entities, for example, in demolition in projects in the White House, but not construction projects. So listeners, if you ever read a reporter, and this is in the news almost every day now, the ballroom garishness, just ask the reporter, don't you realize that it is both illegal and unconstitutional? The only recognition, Steve, was in the Washington Post about a week ago by a Washington Post reporter who was reporting an anonymous business donation of $150 million to Trump to help pay the salaries of the soldiers during the government shutdown. And she had it just right. She said at the end, this is a violation of federal law and it is illegal. So this is where we're at. You can't even get the press to report blatant, this is not shade of gray, blatant illegality of private corporate donations, Microsoft, Apple, NVIDIA, all these companies lining up to give Trump $350 million or more to build this garish ballroom, which has been called Mar-a-Lago North.
And as far as the troops go, it was the billionaire, it was Timothy Mellon, who's been described as a reclusive billionaire of the Mellon fortune. It seems like such a dangerous road when you have private funding for the military, which would probably be Trump's dream to have his own. I mean, he's already treating the military as his private army.
Well, sure. I mean, once you allow private donations, what's to stop some billionaires to donate money to open a copper mine in Alaska, for example, in an environmentally sensitive area? What is to prevent companies associated with the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower condemned in his farewell address from funding a weapons system that Congress thinks is a boondoggle, but is very profitable? So it's quite clear just from common sense that you cannot allow private funding, individual or corporate, for federal projects, because you basically have rendered the congressional appropriations process null and void.
Just moving on to one more topic here, Ralph. Gaza ceasefire. What is your take on what's going on there?
We're starting to return to normal propaganda by Netanyahu. He says, Hamas has not returned a body or a few of the deceased hostages, or someone fired on one of our tanks and we're blaming Hamas, even though they have all kinds of spies and alliances, Israel, inside Gaza now. And then they start the bombing again. And Trump, of course, is in Asia and has a short attention span. So Netanyahu is gaming Trump, inching right back to normal destruction of civilians and civilian infrastructure in Gaza. And only Trump can turn it around. But he hasn't yet made the call to Netanyahu and to say, listen, Bibi, I don't have a short attention span. My reputation is at stake on this permanent ceasefire and allowing 600 trucks of humanitarian aid into Gaza every day, paid for by U.S. taxpayers. You're going to do what I say.
I want to thank our guest again, Dr. Michael Osterholm. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call The Wrap-Up, featuring Francesco DeSantis with In Case You Haven't Heard.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody.
Stand up, step up, step up. You ought to step up. Rise up, rise up. I know you ought to rise up and stand up, stand up. You've been saying